The sound of children's laughter filled the peaceful suburban street as a young boy dragged several large cardboard boxes across his front lawn. The spring air carried the sweet scent of blooming cherry blossoms, and the afternoon sun cast playful shadows through the trees. The boy had spent the entire morning collecting these boxes from his neighbors, each one carefully chosen for his grand vision. His eyes sparkled with excitement as he arranged the boxes into what would soon become his masterpiece. Some might have seemed just ordinary moving boxes, but in his imagination, these cardboard walls would transform into an impenetrable fortress. He had been planning this project ever since his family had gotten their new refrigerator last week, carefully saving the massive box as the centerpiece of his creation. With the determination of a skilled architect, he positioned each box precisely, using rocks from his mother's garden to hold them in place. The largest box became the main chamber of his fort, while smaller ones formed turrets and secret passages. He had borrowed his dad's packing tape from the garage, though he knew he'd have to confess to that little crime later. The boy worked tirelessly, his small hands careful but confident as he cut windows into the cardboard using safety scissors. His tongue stuck out slightly in concentration, a habit his parents always found endearing. Occasionally, he would step back to admire his progress, hands on his hips in a pose that perfectly mimicked his father's thoughtful stance. Inside his backpack lay his most prized possessions: action figures of his favorite superheroes, a flashlight for when the fortress needed illumination, and some cookies he'd managed to sneak from the kitchen. Each item had its special place in today's grand adventure. The flashlight would signal to imaginary allies, while the cookies would serve as provisions for the brave defender of the cardboard kingdom. As he worked, neighbors walked their dogs or jogged past his house. Most smiled at the sight of such innocent play, remembering their own childhood adventures. Mrs. Chen from next door even brought out some juice and watched for a while as he explained his architectural plans with all the seriousness of a professional builder. The fort grew more elaborate with each passing hour. He added a mail slot for secret messages, a periscope made from paper towel rolls, and even a drawbridge crafted from a flattened cereal box. His creativity knew no bounds as he transformed simple cardboard into a world of possibilities. The occasional breeze would rustle the walls of his creation, but he had engineered it well, each box supporting the others in a surprisingly sturdy structure. Time seemed to stop in his private kingdom. He was no longer just a boy in his front yard. He was the guardian of a mighty fortress, defender of imaginary realms, and master of his cardboard domain. His laughter echoed across the yard as he acted out elaborate scenarios, his active imagination painting vivid pictures of adventures yet to unfold. Little did he know that his afternoon of innocent play was about to take an unexpected turn, one that would reshape not only his young perspective, but also spark a conversation that would ripple through his community and beyond. The peaceful afternoon shifted when two police cruisers rolled slowly down the suburban street, their engines humming quietly against the backdrop of chirping birds. The squad cars moved with deliberate purpose, responding to a call that would soon prove to be tragically misguided. Through their windshields, the officers observed the elaborate cardboard structure rising from a well-maintained front lawn, their faces set in professional neutrality. A neighbor had phoned in what they described as suspicious activity, a classic case of judgment clouded by prejudice. The caller hadn't bothered to recognize the child who had lived on their street for years, choosing instead to see a threat where there was only innocence. The patrol cars came to a stop, their tires crunching softly against the asphalt. The boy remained absorbed in his imaginary world, completely unaware of the approaching situation. He was in the middle of defending his cardboard fortress from invisible dragons when the sound of car doors closing finally caught his attention. His small hands froze mid-gesture as he noticed the uniformed figures approaching his yard. 3 officers moved toward the property with practiced caution, their boots pressing into the fresh spring grass. The lead officer's hand rested casually near his belt, a subtle gesture that spoke volumes about preconceived notions. The boy's heart began to race, not from guilt, but from the sudden intrusion of stern adult authority into his magical afternoon. The officers' radios crackled with static-filled chatter, breaking the peaceful suburban quiet. Neighbors began to peek through their windows, drawn by the unusual sight of law enforcement on their typically quiet street. The boys' cardboard fortress, which moments ago had been a castle of dreams, now felt more like an island of uncertainty. The lead officer's voice carried across the lawn, firm but not yet harsh, instructing the child to step away from the structure. The boy's hands trembled slightly as he set down his action figure, his young mind struggling to understand what he could have possibly done wrong. The afternoon sun caught his face, highlighting the confusion and fear beginning to cloud his innocent features. Time seemed to slow down as the officers approached. The boy remembered every detail of his parents' careful instructions about encounters with law enforcement. Stay calm, be respectful, keep your hands visible. Even at his young age, he understood the weight of these lessons, though he never expected to need them in his own front yard. The cardboard fort stood as a silent witness, its hastily cut windows and carefully taped seams now looking less like a childhood project and more like evidence being scrutinized. The cookies in his backpack grew stale, forgotten in the tension of the moment. His flashlight, meant for signaling imaginary allies, lay unused as real-world concerns overshadowed play. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying whispers of approaching footsteps and the subtle sounds of neighbors emerging from their homes. What had started as a perfect spring afternoon was transforming into a moment that would soon capture the attention of an entire community, though none of the participants yet realized the full scope of what was unfolding. The boy stood perfectly still, his small shoulders tense as he faced the approaching officers. His mind raced through all the lessons his father had carefully taught him over the years. Keep your hands where they can see them. Speak clearly. Stay calm. These instructions, once abstract concepts during family discussions, now became his lifeline in this surreal moment. His heart pounded against his chest as the officers' shadows fell across his cardboard creation. The fort that had been his proud achievement now felt like a wall between him and safety. The spring breeze that had earlier carried the scent of flowers now felt cold against his skin. He wanted to run to the house, to the safety of his family, but his father's voice echoed in his memory. Never run. Stay still. Stay brave. The lead officer's voice cut through the tension, asking questions that seemed absurd in their ordinary front yard. What are you doing here? Who lives in this house? The boy's voice trembled slightly as he answered, explaining that this was his home, his yard, his cardboard fort. The words felt strange in his mouth, having to justify his presence in the space where he had spent countless afternoons playing. His young mind struggled to process the situation. Yesterday, he had played in this same spot without any problems. Other kids in the neighborhood built forts and played games all the time. What made today different? The question lingered in his thoughts as he watched the officers exchange glances, their radios continuing to crackle with dispatcher updates. Time seemed to move in slow motion. Each second stretched like honey dripping from a spoon. The boy's legs felt weak, but he remembered his father's words about standing tall, about maintaining dignity even when scared. His hands remained visible at his sides, though they yearned to curl into fists or wipe away the tears threatening to form in his eyes. The neighbors who had earlier smiled at his creative play now stood watching from their porches and windows, their faces a mix of concern and discomfort. Some held phones, recording the scene unfolding on their quiet suburban street. The boy noticed Mrs. Chen, who had brought him juice earlier, speaking urgently into her phone, likely calling his parents. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the lawn, transforming the peaceful scene into something more ominous. The boy's cardboard fortress, which had been a castle of dreams just moments ago, now stood as a silent witness to a moment that would change his understanding of the world forever. His superhero action figures lay abandoned near the fort's entrance, their powers useless in this real-world confrontation. Despite his young age, he understood that this moment was bigger than just him and his cardboard fort. He could feel it in the way the air seemed heavier, in the way the adults around him moved and spoke with careful tension. His father had prepared him for moments like this, but experiencing it firsthand felt different. More real, more frightening, more significant than any practice conversation could capture. The front door burst open as the boy's mother rushed outside, her heart racing at the sight before her. She had been preparing dinner when a neighbor's urgent call alerted her to the situation unfolding in her own front yard. Her bare feet barely registered the cool grass as she moved swiftly toward her child, her maternal instincts warring with the need to remain composed. She approached with measured steps, her hands visible, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions churning inside her. Years of conversations with her husband about exactly this kind of situation guided her movements. The afternoon sun highlighted the tension in her face as she called out to identify herself as the homeowner and the boy's mother. The officers turned toward her, their postures shifting slightly but remaining alert. She could feel the weight of their scrutiny as she moved closer to her son, fighting the urge to run to him and sweep him into her arms. Instead, she maintained a careful distance, her voice clear and controlled as she began explaining that this was their home, that the cardboard fort was simply her child's afternoon project. The neighbors who had gathered continued to watch, some recording with their phones, others speaking in hushed whispers. The mother noticed these details peripherally, but her focus remained on her son and the officers. She could see the slight trembling of her child's hands, the brave face he was trying to maintain, and her heart ached with a mixture of pride and pain. She presented her identification, her movements slow and deliberate. The spring breeze carried the scent of the dinner she'd left unattended on the stove, a mundane detail that highlighted the absurdity of having to prove their right to exist in their own front yard. Her voice remained steady as she explained how her son had spent the morning collecting boxes, how he'd been playing here all afternoon. The mother maintained her composure even as she noticed her son's abandoned action figures lying in the grass, his carefully constructed cardboard walls starting to sag in the late afternoon sun. She had watched him build this fort from their kitchen window, had smiled at his creativity and determination. Now she watched as his innocent play space was treated as suspicious territory. Throughout the interaction, she positioned herself as a bridge between her son and the officers, her presence both protective and diplomatic. She drew upon every lesson she and her husband had discussed about such moments, every strategy they had planned for scenarios they had hoped would never materialize. Her voice remained firm but respectful, her words chosen carefully to de-escalate while maintaining their dignity. The tension in the air slowly began to shift as she provided proof of residency, as neighbors stepped forward to confirm their long-standing presence in the community. Yet, beneath her composed exterior, the mother's mind raced with thoughts of her husband, hoping he would receive her urgent message and return home quickly. Some situations required more than just a mother's careful diplomacy. A black luxury sedan turned sharply onto the suburban street, its tires gripping the asphalt with urgency. The boy's father, still wearing his congressional pin on his lapel, had left an important committee meeting the moment he received his wife's message. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he approached the scene unfolding in front of his home. He parked deliberately behind the police cruisers, his movements measured and precise. Years of navigating both the halls of Congress and the realities of being a black man in America had taught him the delicate balance required for moments like these. His suit jacket felt heavy in the afternoon heat as he stepped out of the car, his face a masterpiece of controlled emotion. The gathered neighbors fell silent as he approached. His presence carried the weight of his position, yet he moved with the urgent concern of a father. The congressional pin glinted in the sunlight, catching the attention of the officers who had been questioning his wife. Their postures shifted subtly as recognition dawned in their eyes. He walked the path to his front yard with deliberate steps, acknowledging the watching neighbors with a slight nod. The cardboard fort, his son's afternoon project, stood partially collapsed from the tension of the preceding events. His boy remained close to his mother, still maintaining the composed stance they had practiced but clearly drawing strength from her presence. The lead officer's expression transformed from authoritative to uncertain as the congressman approached. The father could read the rapid calculations happening behind the officer's eyes, the sudden recognition of who he was, the realization of what this situation could mean. But instead of immediate anger, the congressman chose a different path. He first moved to his son, kneeling down despite his expensive suit pants pressing against the grass. His large hand rested gently on his boy's shoulder, a silent message of safety and support. The touch carried years of preparation for this moment, hours of difficult conversations about dignity in the face of prejudice, and endless love compressed into a single gesture. Rising slowly, he turned to address the officers. His voice carried the practiced tone of someone used to being heard in the halls of power, but now it served a more personal purpose. He spoke about assumptions and their costs, about a child's right to play in his own yard, about the weight of snap judgments and the responsibility of authority. His words were measured but carried an undercurrent of steel. The afternoon light cast long shadows across the lawn as he stood there, a father defending his son's right to childhood innocence, a congressman highlighting a reality that no position of power could fully shield them from. The neighbors who had gathered now watched a different scene unfold, not just the resolution of a misunderstanding, but a teaching moment that would resonate far beyond their quiet street. The officer's demeanor shifted dramatically as recognition set in. Their earlier authoritative stance melted away as they realized they were facing not just any concerned father, but a member of Congress. The lead officer's voice, previously firm and commanding, now carried an apologetic tone as he struggled to explain their presence at the property. The afternoon sun highlighted the beads of sweat forming on the officer's forehead as he fumbled through his explanation. The call they'd received, the protocols they'd followed. Each justification seemed to grow weaker as he spoke them aloud. The other officers stood slightly back, their discomfort evident in their shifting stances and averted gazes. The congressman listened with patience born from years of political experience. His face remained neutral, but his eyes carried the weight of countless similar stories he'd heard in committee meetings and town halls. The cardboard fort, now slightly crumpled from the afternoon's events, stood as a silent testament to how quickly childhood innocence could be interrupted. The watching neighbors had grown in number, their phones capturing every moment of this unexpected confrontation. Some had been there since the beginning, witnessing the transformation from a child's playful afternoon to this potent moment of social commentary. Others had just arrived, drawn by the unusual gathering on their typically quiet street. Instead of responding with anger or threats of political consequences, the congressman chose a different approach. He gestured toward the cardboard fort, inviting the lead officer to take a closer look. He described how his son had spent hours collecting boxes, planning his creation, and building it piece by piece. His voice carried not accusation, but an invitation to understand the gap between perception and reality. The officers followed his lead, now seeing the crude windows cut with safety scissors, the superhero action figures scattered nearby, the juice box Mrs. Chen had brought earlier. Each detail painted a clearer picture of what they had interrupted. Not a suspicious activity, but a child's summer afternoon play. The father's words carried the gentle but firm authority of someone used to shaping policy. He spoke about the importance of community policing, about seeing the humanity in each situation before jumping to conclusions. His stance remained professional, but his hand never left his son's shoulder, a physical reminder of what was truly at stake in these moments. The transformation in the officers' attitudes became more pronounced with each passing minute. Their earlier suspicion had been replaced by evident embarrassment, their training on community relations colliding with the reality of their actions. The congressman's presence forced them to confront not just their mistake, but its broader implications. The congressman knelt beside his son in the grass, the expensive fabric of his suit forgotten in this crucial moment. His voice was gentle but firm as he turned this incident into a lesson about dignity and resilience. The boy's eyes, still holding traces of fear, met his father's steady gaze as they sat beside the cardboard fort that had sparked this entire situation. The father spoke quietly, but his words carried clearly in the hushed afternoon air. He explained how sometimes people make judgments without understanding, how fear can cloud vision, but how maintaining composure and dignity can be the strongest response. The officers stood nearby, their presence now more subdued, inadvertently becoming part of this impromptu lesson in humanity. The boy listened intently, his small hands now steady as they rested in his lap. His father's words transformed the frightening experience into something meaningful, a moment of learning rather than just fear. The congressman shared his own childhood memories, connecting his son's experience to a larger story of change and hope that spanned generations. With careful words, he explained how their family's position, his role in Congress, their comfortable home, their education, didn't make them immune to such assumptions. But rather than letting this embitter them, they could use these moments to create change. He gestured to the watching neighbors, pointing out how many had come forward to support them, how communities could grow stronger through understanding. The father then turned to address the officers, maintaining his teaching tone. He spoke about the power of first impressions, about the responsibility that comes with authority, and about the importance of seeing the whole picture before making judgments. His words weren't angry or accusatory, but they carried the weight of lived experience and the hope for better understanding. The boy watched as his father's calm words seemed to transform the officer's stance from defensive to reflective. The tension in the air slowly dissolved, replaced by something that felt more like a shared moment of learning. Even the neighbors who had gathered seemed to be absorbing the lesson, their faces showing a mix of emotion and understanding. The congressman picked up one of his son's fallen action figures, brushing off the grass and handling it with care. He talked about how heroes come in many forms, sometimes wearing capes and flying through the air, but more often showing courage in small, everyday moments. His words painted a picture of strength that went beyond physical power, touching on the kind of inner fortitude that his son had shown today. News of the incident spread quickly through social media and the neighborhood's messaging groups. Videos captured by neighbors showed the stark contrast between a child's innocent play and the harsh reality of prejudice. The community's response was swift and multifaceted, turning a troubling incident into a catalyst for change. The local parent-teacher association organized an emergency meeting that evening. The gymnasium filled with concerned parents, teachers, and community members, all eager to discuss what had happened. The congressman's presence transformed what could have been an angry confrontation into a constructive dialogue about community policing and racial bias. Online platforms buzzed with different versions of the story. Some focused on the cardboard fort, sharing pictures of the boy's creative construction that had sparked the incident. Others highlighted the calm dignity with which the family had handled the situation. The congressman's measured response became a talking point across news channels, sparking discussions about privilege, power, and the persistent reality of racial profiling. Neighbors who had witnessed the incident firsthand shared their perspectives. Mrs. Chen spoke about bringing the boy juice earlier that day, her voice trembling as she described watching the same child being confronted by officers hours later. Her account, along with others, painted a vivid picture of how quickly assumptions could escalate into frightening confrontations. The homeowners association, usually preoccupied with lawn maintenance and fence heights, found itself hosting discussions about community safety and inclusion. Longtime residents shared stories of similar experiences, while others expressed shock at realizing such incidents could happen in their own neighborhood. The conversation expanded beyond this single incident to address deeper issues of belonging and trust. Local schools seized the moment as an educational opportunity. Teachers adapted their lesson plans to include discussions about prejudice and courage, using age-appropriate language to help children understand the complexity of the situation. The boy's cardboard fort became a symbol of childhood innocence and the need to protect it. Community leaders emerged from unexpected places. The teenager who had captured the clearest video of the incident started a youth group focused on community awareness. senior citizens who had lived in the neighborhood for decades shared stories of how things had changed and how some things remained frustratingly the same. The incident sparked a movement that extended beyond the neighborhood's boundaries. Other communities reached out to learn how they could prevent similar situations, how they could build bridges between law enforcement and residents, and how they could protect the simple joy of a child playing in their own yard. In the months following the incident, the congressman worked tirelessly with local law enforcement to implement meaningful changes. The police department underwent comprehensive training programs that went beyond standard diversity seminars. Officers spent time in community centers, local schools, and neighborhood events, building genuine connections with residents they served. The cardboard fort remained in the front yard longer than anyone expected. Each time rain threatened to collapse it, neighbors would quietly reinforce it with new boxes. It became a symbol of resilience, a reminder of both innocence and change. Children from across the neighborhood would gather there to play, their parents watching with newfound awareness of both the beauty and fragility of childhood freedom. The boy himself showed remarkable growth. While the incident had left its mark, it hadn't dimmed his spirit. Instead, he channeled his experience into creativity, writing stories about his cardboard kingdom that his teachers shared with other classes. His tales always featured heroes who won through understanding rather than force, wisdom rather than power. The local police chief took personal responsibility for reforming patrol protocols. New guidelines emphasized community engagement over confrontation, understanding over assumption. Officers were paired with community members for regular walks through neighborhoods, learning the stories behind each house, each family, each child at play. The congressman's approach to legislation shifted subtly but significantly. His speeches on the House floor now carried the weight of personal experience. He spoke about the importance of seeing the whole picture, not just crime statistics and policy papers, but the human stories behind them. His colleagues noticed how he would often reference cardboard forts and childhood dreams when discussing community policing bills. The mother organized weekly community gatherings in their front yard, where children could build their own cardboard creations while parents discussed neighborhood concerns. These Fort Fridays became a tradition, breaking down barriers between families who had lived as strangers despite sharing the same streets. Local schools incorporated the incident into their curriculum in age-appropriate ways. Students learned about community, understanding, and the power of standing up for what's right. The boys' original cardboard fort design became part of an art project about turning negative experiences into positive change. The story reached far beyond their suburb, inspiring similar initiatives in other communities. News outlets occasionally ran follow-up stories, not about the incident itself, but about the positive changes it had sparked. The image of the congressman kneeling beside his son's fort became a symbol of how communities could transform moments of prejudice into opportunities for growth. As seasons changed and years passed, the lessons of that afternoon remained fresh in the community's memory. The cardboard fort eventually came down, but its impact lived on and changed policies, strengthened relationships, and most importantly, in the understanding that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments.